She's worth more than gold. The mountain man defended. The obese girl, everyone rejected. The autumn of 1876 painted the Montana Territory in shades of amber and rust, but there was no beauty to be found in the eyes of Magdalena Maggie O'Brien as she stood in the center of Cedar Flats' dusty main street, surrounded by jeering townspeople. At 21 years old and carrying more weight than society deemed acceptable for a woman, Maggie had become the town's favorite target for mockery. Today was different, though. Today they'd gone beyond cruel words. "Look at her standing there like she's got a right to be here," shouted Mrs. Pemberton from the general store porch, her pinched face twisted with disgust. Taking up space meant for decent folk. Maggie clutched the tattered shawl around her shoulders, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Just that morning, she'd been fired from her job at the boarding house, the third position she'd lost in as many months. Not for incompetence, but because her presence allegedly upset the guests. Mayor Thornton stepped forward, his considerable belly straining against his vest buttons, the irony of which was lost on no one except himself. "Miss O'Brien, this town has been patient with you, more than patient, but you've become a burden we can no longer afford. I'm giving you until sundown to leave Cedar Flats. If you're still here come morning, the sheriff will escort you out personally." "Where am I supposed to go?" Maggie's voice cracked despite her effort to remain dignified. "I have no family, no money for passage anywhere." "Not our concern," Thornton interrupted coldly. "Should have thought of that before you decided to be, well, what you are." The crowd murmured approval. Children threw pebbles, young men made crude gestures and cruder comments. Maggie felt tears threatening, but refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She'd cried enough in private, alone in her tiny rented room, wondering what cosmic crime she'd committed to deserve such constant rejection. Then, cutting through the cacophony of cruelty, came a voice like distant thunder, low, controlled, and absolutely unyielding. "That's enough." The crowd parted as a figure emerged from the shadows between buildings. He was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders that seemed to block out the afternoon sun. His clothes were buckskin and wool, weathered from hard mountain living. A full beard covered much of his face, but his eyes, storm gray and penetrating, missed nothing as they swept across the assembled townspeople. Jacob Brennan, the mountain man who came to town twice a year to trade furs and restock supplies before disappearing back into the high country. He was a legend in these parts. Some said he'd killed a grizzly with just a knife. Others whispered he could track a single deer across solid rock. But mostly, people left him alone because there was something in his bearing that suggested crossing him would be the last mistake you'd ever make. "This ain't your business, Brennan," Mayor Thornton said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier bluster. Jacob's gaze fixed on the mayor with an intensity that made the smaller man take an involuntary step backward. "When I see a whole town ganging up on one defenseless woman, it becomes my business." "Defenseless?" Mrs. Pemberton screeched. "She's bigger than half the men here." "Size doesn't make someone powerful when they're outnumbered 50-1, Jacob said quietly. "That just makes the 50 cowards." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people suddenly found their boots fascinating. Jacob walked forward until he stood directly beside Maggie. Up close, he was even more imposing, all hard muscle and barely restrained power. But when he glanced down at her, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Miss," he said, his voice gentler now. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Maggie shook her head mutely, not trusting her voice. Jacob turned back to the mayor. "Then she's coming with me." "What?" Thornton sputtered. "You can't just... She's not your property." "You're right. She's not anyone's property. She's a free woman making her own choice." Jacob looked at Maggie again. "I've got a cabin about 40 miles north, up in the Bitterroot Range. It's isolated, the work is hard, and the winters are harsh. but I could use help with cooking, preserving food, mending, all the domestic tasks I'm terrible at. In exchange, I'll pay you fair wages, provide room and board, and ensure nobody ever treats you like this again. Come spring, if you want to leave, I'll take you anywhere you want to go with enough money to start fresh. But the choice is yours. Nobody's forcing you." The entire street had gone silent. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. This stranger was offering her escape, dignity, employment, things that had been systematically denied to her for years. But could she trust him? What did he really want from her? As if reading her thoughts, Jacob added, "I lost my wife 3 years ago to fever. Been living alone since then. I'm not looking for anything except honest work for honest pay. You'd have your own space, your own privacy, your own independence. All I'm offering is a chance." Maggie looked around at the hostile faces surrounding her, people she'd known for years who'd never shown her a moment of genuine kindness. Then she looked up at this mountain man, this stranger who'd stepped between her and a mob without hesitation. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, Mr. Brennan, I accept." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Jacob nodded once, satisfied, then addressed the assembly one final time. "Anyone got a problem with this arrangement?" Sheriff Dalton, who'd been notably silent during the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Brennan, you sure you know what you're getting into? That girl's gonna eat you out of house and home." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jacob's eyes locked onto the sheriff with such cold fury that the lawman actually reached for his gun before thinking better of it. YouTube. "Sheriff," Jacob said, each word precise and deadly, "you just insulted a lady under my protection. You've got exactly 3 seconds to apologize, or I'm going to teach you some manners the hard way. 1. Now wait just a 2. Sheriff Dalton swallowed hard. "My apologies, Miss O'Brien. Spoke out of turn." 3 seconds would have been more entertaining, Jacob muttered. "But I suppose that'll do." He turned to Maggie. "Do you have belongings to collect?" "Just a trunk at the boarding house." "Let's get it then. We'll leave within the hour." YouTube. As they walked through the parted crowd, Maggie heard whispers following them. Speculation about Jacob's motives, cruel predictions about how long the arrangement would last, crude jokes about what must really be happening. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care. Let them talk. She was leaving. At the boarding house, the proprietor initially refused to release Maggie's trunk until Jacob quietly placed a gold coin on the counter, far more than any owed rent could possibly justify. The trunk was promptly produced. Jacob lifted it as if it weighed nothing and secured it to his pack mule. His horse, a massive roan stallion named Thunder, stood patiently as he worked. Then he turned to Maggie. "Can you ride?" I used to. It's been years." "Thunder can carry us both for the first stretch. Once we're out of town, we'll walk together, give him a rest." He mounted in one fluid motion, then extended his hand to her. YouTube. Maggie hesitated. Getting onto a horse behind this enormous man would require physical closeness, trust, vulnerability, all things she'd learned to avoid. Jacob seemed to understand. "I know you don't know me. I know you've got no reason to trust any man, especially not one who just appeared out of nowhere. But I give you my word, Maggie O'Brien, I will never hurt you, never force you, never betray your trust. That's a promise I make before God and these mountains, and I don't make promises lightly." Something in his eyes, a bone-deep sincerity, a shared understanding of pain, made her decision. She grasped his hand, and he pulled her up behind him with surprising gentleness. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid strength of him, and Thunder moved forward without needing any command. As they rode out of Cedar Flats, Maggie looked back one last time at the town that had made her life miserable for 3 years. Several people still stood watching, their faces reflecting disbelief, disapproval, and, in a few cases, what might have been envy. "Don't look back," Jacob said quietly, echoing her own thoughts. Nothing worth seeing there. So Maggie turned forward into the unknown wilderness, trusting her fate to a stranger who defended her when no one else would. The journey took 3 days. Jacob was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was patient with Maggie's slower pace, never showing frustration when she needed to rest. He shared his food equally, never taking more than his fair share. At night, he built 2 separate shelters on opposite sides of the fire, ensuring her privacy and safety. On the second night, as they sat by the crackling flames eating beans and salt pork, Maggie finally worked up the courage to ask what had been nagging at her. "YouTube. Why did you help me? You don't know me. You didn't owe me anything." Jacob stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "My wife, Hannah, she was Crow. We met when I was trading with her tribe about 8 years ago. She was different. Taller than most women, broader built, stronger. Her own people sometimes made her feel like she didn't fit, like she was too much." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "YouTube. When we married and I brought her to the cabin, she told me it was the first time in her life she'd felt like she could just be. No judgment, no expectations, no constant criticism. She said I'd given her the greatest gift, permission to exist exactly as she was." His voice roughened with emotion. "Hannah died giving birth to our son. We lost them both. That was 3 years ago, and I've been alone ever since. When I saw those people treating you that way in Cedar Flats, I saw what Hannah might have faced if she'd been alone, without someone to defend her. And I thought, maybe I could give someone else what I gave her. A place to belong. A chance to be themselves without apology." Tears streamed down Maggie's face. "I'm sorry for your loss. They sound wonderful." They were. Jacob looked up at her, and in the firelight she could see old grief etched into the lines of his face. "But you're not a replacement for them, Maggie. You're your own person with your own value. I want to make that clear. This isn't about me trying to recreate what I lost. This is about giving someone a fair chance at a good life. That's all." "That's everything," Maggie whispered. "That's more than anyone's ever offered me." They reached the cabin on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It sat in a high valley surrounded by pine forests, with a crystal-clear stream running nearby, and meadows that must be spectacular in summer. The cabin itself was larger than Maggie expected, 2 rooms solidly built with a covered porch and a small barn for the animals. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's home," Jacob said simply. "Come on, let me show you around." The interior was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's dwelling. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with cooking implements hung neatly beside it. Shelves held supplies: flour, beans, coffee, ammunition, medical supplies. Furs were stacked in one corner, and tools hung from wall pegs. "The bedroom's through here," Jacob said, opening a door to reveal a room with a large bed, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk. "You'll take this. I'll sleep in the main room." "I can't take your bedroom." "Already decided," Jacob said firmly. "The chest has Hannah's clothes in it. She was tall, strong-built. They might fit you better than what you've got. You're welcome to anything useful." Before Maggie could protest again, he'd retreated to the main room to start unpacking supplies. She opened the chest with trembling hands and found dresses, skirts, blouses, all carefully preserved. They were beautiful garments, lovingly made, and when she tried one on, it fit almost perfectly, just needing a minor alteration here and there. Wearing Hannah's dress felt like receiving a blessing from beyond the grave, as if this woman she'd never met was reaching across death to say, "You're welcome here. You belong." That first evening, Jacob showed her how he managed the cooking fire, where everything was stored, how he preserved meat and vegetables for the long winters. His teaching style was patient, methodical, never condescending. When she made mistakes, he'd simply show her the correct way without criticism. "You'll learn," he said. "Takes time to adjust to mountain living, but you're smart and capable. You'll be running this place better than I ever did within a month." His confidence in her was a revelation. Maggie couldn't remember the last time someone had believed in her abilities. The weeks passed in a blur of hard work and gradual healing. Jacob taught Maggie to smoke meat, tan hides, identify edible plants, recognize animal tracks, predict weather changes. She taught him the comfort of well-cooked meals, the pleasure of mended clothes, the small domestic touches that transformed a shelter into a home. They fell into an easy rhythm. Jacob would check his trap lines and hunt, returning with game and furs. Maggie would transform his kills into food and useful materials, wasting nothing. Evenings were spent by the fire, Jacob carving or repairing equipment, Maggie sewing or reading aloud from the few books he owned. The work was physically demanding, but Maggie discovered she was stronger than she'd ever known. Hauling water, chopping wood, scraping hides, all of it built muscle and endurance. Her body changed, becoming powerful rather than just heavy. For the first time in her life, she felt capable. "You're a natural," Jacob commented one day as she expertly skinned a rabbit. "Hannah learned this same skill, but it took her months. You've got it down in weeks." Maggie glowed with the praise. In Cedar Flats, nothing she'd done had ever been good enough. Here, every achievement was acknowledged, every effort appreciated. One evening in early November, as the first real snows began to fall, Jacob paid her wages for the 2 months she'd been there. $60 in gold and silver, carefully counted out onto the table. "You've earned every penny," he said. "Honestly, you've improved life up here so much I should probably be paying you more." Maggie stared at the coins, more money than she'd ever possessed at one time. With this, she could leave come spring, go anywhere, start over. But the thought of leaving filled her with unexpected sadness. "Jacob," she said slowly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Always." Do you ever get lonely up here? Do you ever wish for more than just this?" She gestured at the cabin, the mountains beyond. He set down the knife he'd been sharpening. "I used to. Right after Hannah died, the silence was crushing. That's part of why I stayed away from people, couldn't bear their pity, their platitudes, but then I got used to the quiet. Started to prefer it even. At least the mountains don't judge you." "And now?" Maggie pressed. "Do you still prefer it?" Jacob met her eyes and something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition, a possibility neither had dared name. "Now," he said carefully, "I'm remembering what it's like to have a partner, someone to share the work and the quiet moments, someone who makes the silence comfortable instead of crushing." "I'd forgotten how good that feels." Maggie's heart hammered. "I feel the same way. I never had that before. Not like this, not where I felt like an equal instead of a burden." They sat in charged silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Then Jacob stood abruptly. "Getting late. We should turn in. Big day tomorrow. Need to check the north line before the next storm hits." But as Maggie lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes, the careful way he'd chosen his words. Something was growing between them, delicate as new ice on the stream. She didn't know what to do with it, but she knew she didn't want to break it. December brought heavy snows and bitter cold. The cabin became a warm refuge against the brutal mountain winter, and the closeness it enforced gradually dissolved the last barriers between Jacob and Maggie. They talked more, sharing stories of their pasts. Maggie's lonely childhood as an orphan passed between reluctant relatives, Jacob's years as a trapper before he met Hannah. They laughed together at small absurdities, worked side by side with comfortable efficiency, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, fell in love. The crisis came on a bitter January morning when 3 rough-looking men rode into the valley. Jacob was away checking distant trap lines, and Maggie was alone in the cabin when she heard horses approaching. She grabbed the rifle Jacob had taught her to use and positioned herself by the window, heart pounding. The leader, a scarred man with cruel eyes, dismounted and kicked at the cabin door. "We know you're in there, woman. Your mountain man's been telling folks down in Cedar Flats he's got a fortune in furs and gold up here. We're here to collect." "There's nothing here for you," Maggie shouted back. "Leave now, or I'll shoot." The man laughed. "You? Shoot? That's rich. Come on out, fat girl. Maybe we'll go easy on you if you cooperate." Rage flooded through Maggie, white-hot and cleansing. She'd been called names like that her entire life, had accepted them as her due. But not anymore. Not here, in the home she'd helped build, the life she'd earned. She fired a warning shot through the window, deliberately missing but coming close enough to make the men scramble for cover. "Next one won't miss," she shouted. "I'm a better shot than you think." It was true. Jacob had taught her well, and she'd practiced diligently. But could she actually shoot a man? Before she had to find out, Jacob's voice rang out from the tree line, cold as the winter air. "Drop your weapons, now." The three men spun to find Jacob standing 20 yards away, his rifle trained on them with unwavering steadiness. He'd approached so silently through the snow that even their horses hadn't noticed. "Brennan," the leader said, trying for bravado, I know exactly what you were doing. You've got 3 seconds to be on those horses and riding out of my valley." 1. The men hesitated, calculating odds. 2. They started backing toward their mounts. YouTube. "If I ever hear of you coming within 50 miles of this place again, I won't bother counting. I'll just shoot. And unlike your reputation, my shooting is something you can rely on, understand?" The men fled, their horses kicking up clouds of snow as they galloped away. Jacob watched until they disappeared, then ran to the cabin. YouTube. "Maggie, are you hurt?" She threw open the door and rushed into his arms, the rifle clattering to the porch. I'm fine. You came back." "Always," he said fiercely, wrapping his arms around her. "I'll always come back. God, when I heard that shot, I thought—" He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his hands cupping her cheeks. "You were so brave. You defended our home." "Our home?" Maggie whispered. "Our home," Jacob confirmed. "Maggie, these past months with you, they've brought me back to life. You're not just hired help. You're not just a friend. He struggled for words, this man who lived more through actions than speech. "You're everything," he finally said. "You're worth more than all the gold in California, more than every fur I'll ever trap. You're worth more than I can possibly express. And I love you. I'm in love with you. I have been for months, but I didn't know how to say it, didn't know if you could ever feel the same about someone like me." Tears streamed down Maggie's face. "Someone like you? Jacob, you're the best man I've ever known. You saw me when everyone else looked through me. You gave me dignity when the world offered only shame. You made me feel worthy when I'd forgotten what that meant. I love you. I've loved you since you stood up to that entire town for a stranger you'd never met." He kissed her then, gentle at first, then deeper. Years of loneliness and pain melting away in the warmth of mutual recognition and acceptance. YouTube +2. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me. Not because of what just happened, not out of obligation or gratitude. Marry me because you want to build a life here together. Marry me because you love me as much as I love you." "Yes," Maggie said without hesitation. "Yes, Jacob, 1,000 times yes." They married in the spring, with a traveling preacher performing the ceremony in front of the cabin. A few friendly trappers from neighboring valleys attended, along with a Crow elder who'd known Hannah and gave them her tribe's blessing. The years that followed were good ones. They built the homestead into a thriving enterprise, with expanded gardens, more livestock, and Jacob's furs bringing top prices at the trading posts. Maggie became known throughout the region as the woman who could cure any illness with her herbal remedies and who could outshoot most men. Children came. 3 daughters and a son, each taught from infancy that a person's worth had nothing to do with their appearance and everything to do with their character and courage. Sometimes travelers passing through the valley would hear the story, how Jacob Brennan, the legendary mountain man, had once faced down an entire town to defend a woman everyone else had rejected, how he declared her worth more than gold and proved it every day for the rest of his life. And if you visited their cabin on a quiet evening, you might find Jacob and Maggie sitting on the porch, gray-haired and weathered by years of mountain living, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. "Still think I'm worth more than gold?" Maggie would ask, a teasing note in her voice, and Jacob would pull her close, kissing her temple, and reply as he always did, "Worth more than all the gold ever mined, all the treasures ever found. You're priceless, Maggie Brennan. Always have been. Just took the world a while to see it." But Maggie knew the truth. It wasn't the world that had finally seen her worth. It was one man, one mountain man, who'd looked past what everyone else couldn't and saw not a burden, not a problem, not something to be hidden or ashamed of, but a woman of strength, courage, and infinite value. And that recognition had changed everything. In the whispers of the western wind, in the stories passed down through generations, the legend lived on. "She's worth more than gold," the mountain man had said, and he'd spent his entire life proving it.